Hello. Good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Pradeep Nayak, and I am the project director of Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership. Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research and knowledge network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of our partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. The V2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions that contributes to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fishing communities around the world and other key NGOs, government and university partners to enhance small-scale fisheries viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged research in 6 countries of Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa, including Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the V2V Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. Today, I'm very happy to welcome you all to the V2B thematic webinar series, which is an initiative of the V2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, policy and practitioner people, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. The thematic webinar series of the V2B Global Partnership takes place on the last Friday of every month, and this will take place throughout 2021. This series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar, including speakers and other web links and details, is available at our website, which is www.v2bglobalpartnership.org. So today's talk is 4th in the series of the webinar, thematic webinar that we have planned for 2021. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Sylvia Salas as our distinguished speaker for today. Sylvia is a fisheries scientist at Cinevest Vista, Merida, Mexico. She holds a PhD in resource management and environmental studies from the University of British Columbia in Canada. Sylvia's research focuses on several issues associated with small-scale fisheries. That includes bioeconomic assessment of fisheries, risk and vulnerability associated with decompression of divers in commercial fisheries, issues involving fisheries value chains and fishing fleets dynamics, and fisher behavior. Sylvia's research has been published in 6 books, and one of her books is Right on Small-Scale Fisheries Viability and Sustainability, that was published by Springer. And she has published in numerous journals, including but not limited to Fish and Fisheries, Marine Policy, Fisheries Research, Canadian Journal of Fisheries, MBOs, and several others. Sylvia is a member of the Mexican Academy of Science, Too Big to Ignore International, ISSF network of seas and coasts in Mexico, and she is also a co-investigator of V2B Global Partnership research. She serves as an expert to FAO, WTO, WWF, and OECD, and many other global organizations. It is my honor to invite Dr. Sylvia Salas to deliver a talk to the V2B thematic webinar series today, and her talk is titled as Vulnerability and Viability of Small-Scale Fisheries, Drivers and Prospects. Over to you, Sylvia. You can start now.
Hi, Pradeep. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation to share some ideas about this topic that is really interesting and very relevant within the context of small-scale fisheries. I'm going to present first some concepts to get into the theme, and followed by the context of the Latin American fisheries, small-scale fisheries, placing some of the main challenges that these fisheries are facing. And I will present two case studies associated to this book that we produced within the TVTI network, and followed by final remarks. In the last decade, we have been seeing an increase in publication reports associated to the vulnerability of coastal areas and fisheries. And the concept is presented by several authors within the context of the impacts and how people deal with different impacts that can come from internal and external factors. It also will depend on the susceptibility and how these factors can potentially have a very adverse effect. Turner also defines these multidimensional factors within the context of social, economic, and environmental issues, but also the impacts can be multidimensional. Why is it important to look at vulnerability in the context of fisheries? Fisheries are very dynamic and complex systems, and always exposed to uncertainty along the value chain. So people are exposed to the access to resources, the availability of the resources, changes in regulation, changes in market, and also very highly exposed to environmental conditions that are changing and impacting their activity along the value chain. This vulnerability is going to depend on the level of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. This adaptive capacity is going to be built through a learning process. Once these sources of change can be identified, but also the triggers. When I talk about sources of change, or stressors is one thing, but some of the triggers might be there, but they don't respond to those changes until something is generate the change. So resilience is something that we always try to define also, but and it comes, this concept, from even from physics, that has the capacity of a system to return to the conditions that they were before they have an impact. In this case, we need to evaluate all these components to define the vulnerability and this learning process to get into the resilient system. So I liked this diagram that was produced by Sinner when assessing the fishing communities in Africa to define the concept, and it assesses the communities and the context of sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure. So we have this sensitivity has defined it as a component of the system to be harmed after exposure of the stress. And the exposure is defined here for the circles with different sizes. And it's going to be defined by the degree of that the system, the region, or the individual has been under this level of stress. The adaptive capacity is going to depend on the characteristics of the systems or the people that can anticipate the changes and can reduce the effect of those changes on the system as a consequence of those impacts. So here we have that the reduction in adaptive capacity, the less the adaptive capacity and the sensitivity can generate more vulnerable systems. Here the red dots correspond to Kenya. And you can see each of the circles are one community. And we have like Mauritius and Seychelles, like less vulnerable communities, while Kenya and Tanzania has more vulnerable communities. The level of exposure is higher, the adaptive capacity is lower, and the sensitivity is very high. So these make very vulnerable systems. The analysis that Sinner did was analyzing the coral reef areas in those communities. And given the high dependence of the fisheries in those areas, generates this vulnerability. So once he finished this paper, he also has another paper where he goes deeper in the context of the Kenyan fisheries. And then he develops this diagram that is also very illustrative. So he says that we have the ecological vulnerability with all the components of the system, exposure sensitivity, and the recovery potential or capacity. But we have also the social system that is highly dependent on the ecological system. So if this system is vulnerable, this system, the social system, is going to be vulnerable. So this generates a socio-ecological vulnerability. The way they assess this vulnerability is looking at different indicators that include the ecological and the socio-economic component. There are many analyses that have been, papers that I read that have been following the indicators proposed by Sinner. So how people respond, how this adaptive capacity can be evaluated. Based on the response, we have to make the distinction between the disruptions and the shocks. The disruptions can be some changes in the system that can be accumulative, but are sort of predictable and can generate stress in the communities or the system of the group of people, but they are kind of responding to these changes because they are used to these disruptions. The shocks, however, are unexpected and people are not well prepared. So generally the impact can be higher. However, in the context of climate change, we can say that some of this stress or some of the changes that these conditions are generating, like increasing storms, the frequency of the storms can have this accumulative process, but also we have the hurricanes that have increasing in frequency and intensity. So the climate change has a very high impact within this context. So in times of crisis and times of, here is a picture of 2020 when we in this area, I live here, and we were in the eye of the hurricane because we were in this condition of the pandemic, and we had 3 storms, one after another, and then one hurricane. So these, all the Caribbean area were highly exposed, and is one of the factors that contribute very highly to the vulnerability of fisheries in this region. So in times of crisis, people could tend to compete or cooperate. You can compete because the resources are limited, but you can also cooperate because you see the advantage of doing so. Then you have to make trade-offs and very important decisions in the right moment. And that happens with COVID. We have this, COVID has a good experience, not so good to say so, but a good experience of how people learn how to cooperate in times of crisis. I will talk about COVID later in more detail. What are the factors that define this adaptive response? Where several authors define that the factors that define the adaptive response are based in the stability, the resources available, and the flexibility of the system, of the community, or from the person. So people can have proactive response or reactive response. The proactive response involves a learning process, an adaptive process, and being prepared. The reactive response is more waiting for the support of external actors, of the external sources of help. But we cannot say that people that are reactive are just lazy or don't want to respond. And I like a lot the chapter that Marin included in our book, because he made very important emphasis that the response is going to be a long process of learning and adapting. So it's going to depend on the type of impact that you receive, or the system or the community receives, and the intensity and the conditions, the context, the time, the space, and also the institutional context. And when I talk about institutional context, I don't talk about only formal institutions. We can have informal local institutions that play a very important role in how people can respond under these conditions of stress. So for the stability, the factors that can contribute is highly important, the level of exposure, the assets available, the access to savings of credit that can be saved by the same people, or that can be saved by an organization, or it can be saved or have this financial support for the person or within the community can be very important to generate this stability, and especially having alternative sources of income. When I talk about resources, it's not just monetary resources, but also social resources, support from a group, networking, organization, the level of organization within the community. Also, some support from the government and the infrastructure. So, for instance, evacuation can be easier if there are good roads, or there is a community close where I can go in the case of a hurricane, for instance. And the flexibility has to do a lot with alternatives. If people have alternative income, if they have the diversification of livelihoods, is very important for this flexibility. And also the capacity to move, or the skills to do something else. If I don't know what else to do, I might not be able or willing to leave the community and try something new. We have seen it during this pandemic that many people went into, at least locally here, into construction, because the construction didn't stop. So there was an alternative for them while they were not able to fish. So here is another very important concept when we talk about vulnerability, and it's viability. Usually, we always talk about sustainability of fisheries. But what is sustainable? Sustainable can be maintained in the time, but can be a very bad condition that is maintained in the time. So here is when it becomes important to talk about viability. So the systems are very dynamic. There are many changes that can generate different responses, but sometimes those changes can take you to a point in where there is not a way back, or there is not a way to maintain the conditions as they are. So it needs a shift, a very important shift, and it's a buffer. So how to support those changes? So the changes can have an impact and generate some outcomes that can be positive or negative, depending on the response that the system, the person, or the community have. So in this case, we talk about the tipping points. The tipping points can be also defined as the point of no return. Within this context, the tipping points generate irreversible shifts. So it needs to make a change, an alternative to change, so we can reduce the impacts or avoid these high costs. So here in this diagram, we have this like ecosystem functions and ecosystem structure. Here is the tipping point where we have this threshold. So it can go in this direction, but can never go back at this level. So we can have a change, a shift that allow some recovery and new stability, new level of stability, or we can let it go and allow this degradation process. So the system can have a positive or negative outcomes depending on the actions that are taken at this level when a tipping point is reached. To have an example on this, I can use this figure of the catches. These are catch trends on the grouper fisheries, one of the most important fisheries in the region where I work. So people always were concerned and keep being concerned about the sustainability of these fisheries. But this sustainability is not just in the context of volume, but also it has a very important impact in the economic activities of the coastal areas and the livelihoods of the people that depends on this fishery. We talk about sustainability. During this period, the fishery was sustainable at this level. So in the 70s, the fisheries were reaching 20,000 tons. Currently, we have between 8,000 tons. So each of these periods was sustainable for some time. But once you reach this level, it just generates high concern for the community, for the people that depends on this fishery. So why this fishery remained or was maintained, because also there was a very important increase in exports and the value of the fishery compensated for the volume. However, the levels that currently are it has generated some worry for the community. And now the stakeholders have decided to work together to develop plans of recovery of the system, especially because for export, you need to cover some standards. So this crisis can generate opportunities that can be positive or can be negative, depending on the track that you follow or the group of people follow. And I borrowed this slide from Gary Martin in 2000 that is in this site. If you wanna look at it, it's a very interesting presentation that is included in there, but I liked this slide that presents the concept of viability as a play. It's a first act, the system is sustainable. The second act is there is a negative tip. This could be a negative tip. So we can do something like change from sustainable to unsustainable by introducing destructive fishing methods. So we know that the fishery is in bad shape, but we keep doing something that is not helping for the process of recovery. Or we can have this positive tip as a change from unsustainable to sustainable. And in that case, we can create a marine sanctuary or we can create a recovery plan. So it's a double action of changing the gear. At this moment, timely decisions are very important. And positive actions also can change from viability to unviability of a fishery. So in this context, how are the conditions of the Latin American fisheries in this region is very complex. We have different regions that are exploited, like Atlantic, Pacific, Amazonian, and there is a lot of inland fisheries in the area. We have different languages, different ethnical communities, and different ecosystems. So we cannot generalize about the region at all. This important region contributes with 12% of the total market worldwide. Also, very high contributions of small-scale fisheries in the region and globally. There is high diversity of ecosystems, as I mentioned, where people operate, and so they have to adapt to the biogeographical conditions to operate in the system. There are high diversity of the species that are targeted with different multiple arts or methods, and there is a very important demand on the region. Looking at the value chain analysis, something that has been growing in this process is our countries, so countries like in Asia or in Africa, we generate high value species and send it abroad, and we consume very cheap species. Corona published a paper very interesting in this context. But also now, if we want to remain this export process, we have to cover some requirements according to the market demands. And one of the requirements is have sustainable fisheries. They have good practices while fishing. So in this context, illegal fishing or open access conditions don't help so much. So this is one of the challenges that we have in the region. There is interaction among fleets, some of the large-scale fleets operating where the small-scale fleets operate. There is limited capacity in fisheries assessment and management. We did a workshop long ago, but we realized that the practices of assessment haven't changed much or are highly concentrated on the analysis of the resources and looking very slim within the context of social and economic assessment. So, and we have all these new challenges like climate change and COVID, and some of the species in the region are in the context of overexploitation, like the case of the grouper that I already mentioned. So how we can maintain sustainable fisheries when the systems are already vulnerable? How we can define the viability of these fisheries? It's very important because things are changing so fast and the impacts are so evident that we cannot avoid looking at those. So what are the drivers of change? There are many factors that can modify the system that can have an impact in the context of the activities. So one of those are that there are new, or not so new, activities that are growing in the coastal area. So they are taking the space for that compete with the fisheries, the small-scale fisheries, and those include the urban development, tourism, energy parks that can go inland or even within the bays, coastal erosion, pollution, habitat degradation. All of that are going to affect the resources that generate that support the fisheries that are highly dependent on the livelihoods, the local people. One of the very important problems that we have been facing, especially in the Caribbean area, is this problem of the sargassum that has been as a result of changes in currents. And so also because of those conditions, there are changes on the distribution of the species. And then this is something that I remember one fisherman told me why I should care for the climate change. Why, if this is going to happen in 50 years? And I said, well, it's not happening in 50 years. It's already happening. The species distribution are changing. And then maybe you will not be able, or your son is not going to be able to catch whatever you are used to catch. So climate change is there. And we have all these drivers of change that can have an impact. And on top of that, if there is not good governance, if there is not a system that can support the communities and ensure the sustainability of the resources, the problem can be higher. So we can have environmental, economic, and social impacts. Pollution is one very, very, very important problem we have, and especially in plastics. And this is something that has called the attention more recently. But then it's like we are fighting too many fronts in the region, in the world. And then why we need to assess then risk and vulnerability conditions? Because we need to respond. And also the countries and the government need to respond. And sometimes these countries don't have the capacity to respond on their own, so they need the external support. But the organizations that support need to know how vulnerable the system is, how the countries, and if there are not enough resources, where I should place the money to support the communities that are under some disastrous conditions. So some index have been developed by the World Development Bank and different organizations to assess the level of impact and disasters that can impact in one region. There is this report of the International Development Bank by Carlatti that is very interesting, presenting the several disasters index. And they emphasize the relevance in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean region, the flooding, rainfall, storms. So those account for more than above of the 50% of the frequency. So we have also hurricanes, epidemics, and fires. And something that is also recognized, and that all these impacts cannot be equally affecting all the countries. And even within a country, there could be differences. And here, like for instance, the changes in temperature, we can see that the major changes have been observed in the Atlantic more than in the Pacific. And here, there is some concern for this, what is called the hot spot in front of Uruguay and Argentina. And this is very important because they are highly dependent on benthonic organisms. So the fisheries are some like the yellow clam is one of the resources that have been affected for these changes. So how to address all these problems? So it's when there is not enough support, when there is not enough money to do it. So the international organizations are based on assessing indicators, index. But if we don't have that information, if there is not an analysis of what is happening, then there is not a way to get that support. So it's very important to have information that can promote and facilitate this adaptation through a cooperative process. And also having that information can help to see, we can say we need a financial support. How much, how vulnerable the system is, for how long. So that's why it's very important to have this information. So in the case of the climate change, we can have different impacts, many impacts. And given all this process associated, or these effects associated to the climate change, so the acidification and the frequency of the storm, all that can change the ecosystems and the production. And that can affect the composition of the species, even the sizes of the organisms. We have seen a reduction on sizes in some of the organisms. And then all that, the bleaching of the coral can reduce the productivity of some areas, and that affects the fishing, the tourism, and also the storm can affect safety and infrastructure of the coastal areas, and all that can generate risk and uncertainty, and then has an impact on the society as a whole. So that requires adaptation, mitigations, and money. Again, money. So it's very important to have these resources. But the other problem is how these resources are going to be allocated, depending on the level of exposure, depending on the level of vulnerability. So here, it's very important to bring another concept, that is preparedness for the response. Preparedness within for these shocks, for those changes. So disaster preparedness involves, it can be defined for individuals, communities, and government. So all of those need to be prepared. And that includes with these three components, that is awareness, response, and recovery. So awareness to anticipate the changes and how to get ready to have a response that can depend on willingness of evacuate or willingness to cooperate. I remember a fisherman that was telling me that when we had this hurricane Isidore in 2002, he didn't want to be evacuated, and he suffered so much within during the period of that the hurricane hit in his community. And he said, now the first that gets into the bus when it's an evacuation is me. So response, because of this learning process, people are more willing to cooperate and not ready to face those changes. And the third one is recovery, because this recovery doesn't depend on the government to do everything. So it is depending on the cooperation of all those involved. So it needs also to have a contingency plan. So if you are prepared and you know that this could happen, then you can prepare and you can have some saving for these potential disaster conditions, especially in those areas that were highly exposed to those hurricanes or storms. Here in the tropical areas, we just get prepared. You have almost, I don't know, I cannot tell how many things you look at when you know that there's a hurricane coming. You have to be prepared. And that is because there is a learning process. We learn, we have to adapt, and then you invest in safety, you invest in measures. And some communities here in the area has, once the hurricanes hit and the salt water cover gets into their houses, was destroying the walls. So they started to put some cover into the walls, so that now they are protected even if they get some flooding in the area. So they are investing on this, getting prepared. And also it's very important to have a long-term planning. So in this context, generally we need the other problem that we have in some cases is that the government changes and then the plan changes, and then it's not continuity and those long-term planning. So the need to have a contingency plans that can be applicable regardless of who's there. So here, the way I present now, within those case studies that I was referring to about the case of the tsunamis, the earthquake and tsunamis that hit in 2004 and 2010 in the Pacific area. So in 2010, according to the reports, 53 countries were sent an alert of the tsunami. And among those, Peru, Chile, and Colombia were in this region. And Marine presents an analysis of the assessment of what happened during the tsunami and after the tsunami. So the contingency plan for recovery and also how people responded during the tsunami. So he reports that 80% of the Chilean population was affected. It was a very, very huge impact. It covered 600 kilometers of coastline, affecting tourism and fishing, has the main activities within the region, and they lost the fishing capacity in 60%, which demand 30 billion US dollars to recovery in the recovery plan. This due to the lack of preparedness. And there were many important environmental changes in the landscape. Some areas that were dry got water, and some areas that had water got dry, and they remain like that. So the changes were permanent. So what he did was using this social network analysis, assessing how people responded during the contingency and how people responded after the contingency. So he said that there were not too many fatalities because people were very responsive to evacuate, regardless that they didn't have enough information that prevent them from the tsunami, because it seemed that was like one or three big waves that came with some spacing in time. So this is very important. It's not this earthquake that you feel and then you can have some momentum, but it was three events, very important, big events. So because people had the experience in 2004, now they were ready to evacuate. So, however, because of the changes in the area, there were changes in the livelihoods. People had to adapt and had to look for new alternative livelihoods. And the disaster and rehabilitation policies, however, were not equally applied in all the region. So in this context, Marine makes an emphasis that in literature, many people refer to the networking and social capital as the capacity to define the capacity to respond. But he also indicated that it's a lot to do with the amount of damage that have the area and the isolation. So if the area can be very isolated, the capacity of recovery can be limited. So it's what I refer that Marin indicated that we shouldn't place only to the social capital and networking the capacity of recovery, but it's very important to indicate the level of damage and the conditions of the area. Something that also he wants to address is that a paternalistic response can undermine the individual and collective capacity of organization and response. So he said that he analyzed 21 organizations, and he defines the post-disaster recovery trajectory with these 5 components, from innovation to recession. And from the 21 organizations that he worked on, only 3 of them had got into, after 4 years, achieved this level of innovation or normalization. And 11 of them were in the recession process still. So as I mentioned, there is not the capacity of the system. It's going to be equally responsive to recover. So there are many issues that have to be looked at when we talk about adaptability. And just going from this big case into a more local case and in the assessment of risk and safety, I want to present the case of the analysis made by my colleague Hashim and some colleagues from University of California, and I had collaborated with them. So in this case, the analysis was placed on analyze the perception of risk of the divers and also the risk of decompression. So we have different response or attitudes toward risk from all of us, from people. We can be risk averse or risk prone, and it all depends on our previous experience. So if we have a bad experience under some conditions, we are going to be more risk averse. But also, depending on the expected benefits, we could be risk prone. So depending on the confidence on the resources we have to respond, or the fishers have to respond, and then we have something in between. So the fishers got this computer in their suit, so we could grab information on time, depth, species, and location. So time and depth define a lot the risk of decompression. So this information could be the information downloaded to a computer, and we were able to analyze the diving behavior of the fishermen. So here, this is the diving behavior pattern of a diver that fish lobster. And then the pattern is they go down, get lobster, go up, give the lobster to the fisher that is in the boat, and go down and again down, up and down. We call it this yo-yo pattern. And sometimes the divers don't have a stop, a decompression stop here. In the case of the sea cucumber, they go down, they have a sack where they put the sea cucumber, and they keep down all the time until they get up. So both of those patterns are risky. So what we saw also is that when the abundance of both of the resources decline, fishermen went to other areas that could be deeper and could spend more time diving, which exposed them to high vulnerability. In the case of the sea cucumber also, they could remain long time. We had a record of one diver that was 120, more than 2 hours diving there with not stop. So all of these conditions expose the divers to vulnerability and decompression. And what to do with these conditions? So this learning process has been an incentive, especially for my colleagues, to keep working with the communities. So among the interventions actions that we had was the modification of the hookah system, because also the divers were having some problems with the pollution of the diving system for carbon monoxide, because the way and the system operated. They have this compressor and one house that can be 100 meters, and they can be diving forever there almost. So one of the interventions was to modify the system. We didn't have enough money to do much more than modify 8 compressors. But the experience and what the results that we showed to them made an incentive for the others to make changes on their own. After the intervention we had, a few months later, 30 more compressors were adapted, and now there are many more. Also, he developed this manual for safety measures and how my colleague is a medical doctor. So one of the factors that we're analyzing too is what were the health conditions of the fishermen that can make them prone to the compressions. So also there was a program developed to have some campaigns going into the communities to check up of the fishermen, some training for first aid, and also to increase the capacity to respond to these conditions. So this learning process, like in the case of the big tsunamis, can teach us how to go about those changes, and also small work in the small communities also can teach us how to work and keep the attention in some of the important issues that can generate vulnerability, and also the most important, how to go about that. So here is another very important case that is teaching us that vulnerability is there and that the impacts are there. So we had COVID with all these challenges placed into the whole world, no, and the fisheries are not the exception. So in addition to all these factors that I refer that are there, that are already placing some stress into the communities, into the fisheries, into the ecosystems, we had COVID. So there was all these accumulative disruptions and the reconfiguration of the value chain. So the lack of mobility reduces the exports, tourists, and all that affected the value chain along the communities. And then also, as I mentioned, we have, at least in the Caribbean, all these hurricanes hitting, and then people were recovering, and there is here another one coming. So with all these conditions and lack of mobility, there was also limitations to some surveillance, and the increase in illegal fishing has been reported in many, many places. What are the positive outcomes of these very bad conditions? Some adaptations. So there was a social, economic, health impact that generated vulnerability. And maybe the viability of some communities or some industries or some sectors is still at risk. So that one of the adoptions was adoption of technology and searching for new markets. The problem is that not everybody can have the same level of adoptions or same conditions to look for these new markets or adoption of technology. CEPAL reports that there is a very important digital gap. So in our region, so we have very many countries, especially in the South. South America is in a better condition than Central America. And even within one country, we have very different conditions. I always say that we have different Mexico within Mexico, because the conditions in the South are very different to the North and the North Pacific or the South Pacific. So we have to look at those differences when assessing this vulnerability and viability. We had recently a panel where we were discussing the impact of COVID, and this is some of the results presented by my colleague, Christina Pita. And then what were the shifts? This is when the shifts, this viability, searching for this viability to maintain the activity. There's shifting the gears. And some of the shifting of the gears involve changes in target species. Some of those that remain fishing were searching for species that had low value but more abundance, so they don't invest too much, they don't have too much cost on the trip, that they can recover the cost of the trip, changes in fishing effort, and changes in the presentation of the products that they catch. So how to maintain, we have a product that needs infrastructure to maintain the product. So, and you don't have this infrastructure, especially in the conditions of COVID, how to deal with that, just changing, freezing, smoking, drying, find new markets, new buyers. And of course, many of those were in the hope of getting some financial aids, and some was this direct market through e-market or local consumption. So many of these things were possible because there was cooperation. Cooperation within the community, cooperation with government, cooperation with organizations, social, civil society. So some of the people were willing to start reopening their activities and exposing themselves. I remember talking to one, the owner of a big plant that said, I cannot stop, because if I stop, all the people that depends on me is there. And so he made a contact, direct contact with restaurants in the States. So he cut all the middleman that he had before, just trying to sell his products to also maintain the activity running. So another thing that can show the relevance of cooperation is that at the region, we have different groups or organizations that can and are already working, trying to help in this very difficult time, from the local to the international. At the international level, FAO has presented several virtual dialogues and promote exchange among ministers of the countries, also several meetings, and how to connect and some market connection, sharing information. Some of the banks have been also analyzing the conditions to promote and give credit at the regional level. And we have these networks that have been very important to keep feeding with information, like the Hidden Harvest and TBTI group, that have always trying to raise the profile of small-scale fisheries, presenting information. And the organization of civil society are very important here. They have been like a bridge with the government and academics and communities. So those organizations are at the international or local level. At the regional level in Central America, we have OSPESCA, we have CARICOM, and all of those are trying to create these crossing interaction sectors. And at the country level, things are very different depending on the conditions of each country. But many of those have placed a high importance to the process of technology, of how to adapt technology. Because technology has been also very important now for school, for education. We cannot stop that. So this has been a very important process here. And at the local level, we have this local trade and how to rebuild livelihoods, and at the regional level, and all the searching for support. One of the problems is here, of course, the countries have been more weight to the sanitary context to try to control the sanitary problem. So if you have limited resources, where are you going to place? And when I talk about resources, it's not just money, it's also people. It's who is going to do the job? And that has been a really big problem in the current conditions we're living in. But with that, it's even more important to recognize that we are in a context in which vulnerability is there. The conditions of uncertainty and risk are there. So we need to recognize that to be able to move from this resistant capacity to a transformative capacity and generate some resilience. So need to learn that we have to generate contingency plans that can work in the long term to change this reactive response to a more proactive response. So here it's very important to have assessments, to have groups of people like this group of B2B that are working to do this assessment of the factors. What are the factors? If we don't know what are the factors that generate vulnerability, we cannot develop this contingency plan. We cannot develop adaptive responses. We cannot develop proactive responses. So it's very important to have ocean planning too, because the risk is there. And it's very important to uh, foster, promote local cooperation to build capacity. So in this context, also TVTI developed a project that is called Blue Justice that is generating some kind of observatory. If we don't know what is happening, nothing will happen. We cannot solve the problems. If we don't know what are the risks, then the risk and the people that are under the conditions of risk will not get attention. So this idea of kind of observatories or a system where people can place their concerns about the potential risk into their community, into their livelihoods, is a project that TVTI is leading in this project of Blue Justice. So we have resources. We have all these tools like the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the fisheries guidelines. We have people working, developing like some report that had helped us. I think it's too much information there. In fact, it's too much that we sometimes don't have the capacity to assimilate, to integrate, but it's there. We can work together because we have those tools. And also we have this networking, these groups that can facilitate and help to learn and to create this networking. This social capital cannot be only in the communities of the government, but also into the academia, into the society that can build a capacity to move forward. So we have the tools, we have the people. And with this, it's important, I want to stress the relevance to assess the context, because not even within one region, even within one country, or even within one community, the context could be different. So we have to assess the context to be able to have timely decisions to respond. And we have to accept that the uncertainty is there, the risk is there, and we cannot change it, but we can reduce uncertainty with knowledge, with information. And after the crisis, we need to be adaptive, but going into a positive adaptation and moving from vulnerability to viability. We need to build capacity at different levels, financial level, different learning process that can help people to rebuild their ecosystems, to rebuild their fisheries, to rebuild their communities. So also it's very important that the policymakers can promote proactive strategies, not paternalistic strategies that leave the community or the people very highly dependent on those external supports. It's important to bridge ties among the actors and move forward. And to enhance this adaptive capacity, we need cooperation, organization at the local, national, and international level. We can use those resources. They're already there, but we need to learn how to use them. And with this, I conclude. Thank you so much. Did you have any questions?
Thank you very much, Sylvia. That was a really great example of the multidimensional nature of vulnerability and viability, and kind of providing a direction towards more proactive and transformative actions that is required on the ground and elsewhere in order to achieve the transition from vulnerability to viability. I see that we are already flooded with questions on YouTube. May I just ask Simmer to transfer those questions from YouTube live stream to this platform, so
Sure.
we can engage in a discussion.
Okay. Well, the first question we have is from Emily. She mentions you mentioned cooperation or competition for fish between fisheries. Have dolphin and whale interactions and bycatch impacted this and increased competition for fish in any way? I think this question is asking what the role of bycatch plays in cooperation and competition amongst fishers.
Yeah, well, this is a very, very tricky problem, because also I just got a paper that I will share with you about this viability of the vaquita we have in Mexico, you know, because when vaquita is a population that is very reduced now, and they get trapped in the nets of fishers that catch totuaba, but totuaba is already illegal also to catch totuaba, but they keep on catching totuaba. And then the competition, we have two sectors, or I don't know if we can call it two sectors, but bycatch now is one of the big problems that remains. And then competition, I don't know if we can call this competition when we talk about bycatch, because you have those that are trying to reduce these bycatch problems that are affecting the ecosystem, because if we affect the ecosystem, at the end, we are going to affect the resources that are also in this system that the fishers depend on. So those things, and for instance, we had an embargo in Mexico for several years with the tuna because of the dolphins problems. What it created was programs to reduce the bycatch, but also programs to promote local consumption also here. We have also this threat of having another embargo because of the vaquita. So this goes beyond cooperation or competition. We need to work together, of course, but then the problem here can be bigger, can go beyond even that situation. What I was talking about cooperation and competition was also who you favor. You cannot favor, or say just you favor the fishermen, you favor the dolphins. It's how we solve the problem in order to reduce the impact. That's a different context. But if we are in these conditions, just put in the context of cooperation and competition, vaccination now. How many people will be able to be vaccinated? So if you have an opportunity, you run for the vaccine. You are not waiting for your neighbor to come with you. You run for the vaccination now. It's what I was referring with this competition or cooperation.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question from Vikash Rath. Good evening from India. Just think if adaptive responses can be defined with respect to some thresholds of sustainable operations, because it seems that under certain compelling circumstances that force to cross that threshold, the qualitative or quantitative nature of this adaptive response may undergo substantial change.
Yes, of course. Totally agree with that quality of those changes, because it's not just to change, it's you have to change for better.
Right. And then there is just a quick comment on the information on diving behavior is interesting. Some confusion regarding the behavior of the sea cucumber in response to resource abundance.
Yeah, what happened is that like the sea cucumber doesn't move, like the lobster moves. So there is more searching process. So but if the diver finds a very good place where there is a lot of sea cucumber, they're gonna remain until they clean the area. That's the difference between lobster and sea cucumber.
Okay. Those were all the questions. There are many thank yous for presentations today.
Okay, I have a question from Derek Armitage. Thank you. This was really informative. Could you talk a bit more about examples of successful decision making or governance process that help to shift gears, as you say, from vulnerability to viability, or move from reactive to proactive processes, where local or regional scale? I'm wondering if there are good co-management examples that have helped.
Yeah, I guess we have here we have in the area, for instance, communities that were operate in one bay, and they allocated rights for within the bay for what they call parcelas. So fishermen can fish in their area. They place artificial habitats to fish lobster, and there is a co-management program there. So according to the law, the sea cannot be parcellated, the sea cannot be owned by people. But like the government see that this is working for the community, they haven't modified the system. So in that case, they have favored that system and even promoted. They have shown those examples of good management within the communities. And then it started with one bay. Now we have the South Bay also, that are doing the same. So if the system works for them, even it goes, could say that goes against the law, but within some rules that are for the benefit of the ecosystem and for the benefit of the community, the government are favoring those programs of co-management. And another issue of proactive response, regarding the proactive or reactive response, like in our country, we had with this pandemic situation that some of the fishermen got some money. So they were waiting for this money. And then even the government created a record of the fishermen. There was already a record, but they said, okay, we're gonna create a new record of the fishermen, so we give the support. So people that were not even fishermen, or they were just relatives of the fishermen, got into that list to get the money. You know? But this money was very limited money, that some of the fishermen told me they were getting a card that they can exchange, they can get some food supplies only in one store, you know. So that limits, because I said I have other needs. I have needs for sanitary supplies. I cannot get there. But with this system, it's not working. So there are some things that might be a goodwill, but at the end, the effect could not be the expected one. So we can have some things that can, at the moment, solve the problem, but in the long term, it's not solving the problem because it's not creating this capacity that can strengthen the conditions of the people and the community. I don't know if that the question was going in that direction.
There is, are you reading it? Okay.
Yes. There is one more question from Janmajaya Mishra. He's saying, thank you, Prof. Sylvia, for the nice presentation. How do relevant policies shape the transitions from vulnerability to viability of small-scale fisheries in Mexico? Please share some insights. Thank you.
I guess this concept of viability is just taking some momentum. At least from what I have been searching, it's been there for a long time, but we haven't been adopting that until more recently. And I think it's because we have been recognizing the relevance of addressing vulnerability. So in terms of how to promote viability, there are, I think in our country, I always say that my country has a lot of laws, policies. The problems we have sometimes is with the implementation. I don't think, I am just trying to recall some of the actions that could be driven into that. Okay, yeah. One, the policymakers that are in charge of environmental issues, and we have CONAM that works in protected areas. So one of the things that some of the programs associated that CONAM has been promoting with fishermen that are in the areas is to generate some capacity. For instance, there is a coral reef in the Caribbean where they have created some, like, they used to have just small houses, like a camp going there. They didn't have access to fuel. So they gave some program to support to create some infrastructure that could favor them, especially because once they get into the reef, they don't have anything there. So they have to be protected. So the program facilitated some improvement in that area. This is the Banco Chinchorro, where they fish lobster, conch, and some fish species. And then also giving some training, some capacity building for recognize the relevance of sustainability of the resources. I think CONAM had done some of this work, so it's not like a global government, so it's just by sections. Maybe we have some cases, but we need to learn more about this viability issue. I think it's more recent that we have been taking more emphasis on that.
There is one more question by Anna Carolina. Anna is asking, can we take vulnerability and viability as two sides of the same coin? And what are some of the, interactions between them?
I would not say that because, in fact, the threshold comes when vulnerability is there. So that's when you have to make this shift to viability. It's like people talk, it's the resilience is the opposite of vulnerability. But as I mentioned, we have to look at all the components because there could be a system or a country or a community that is highly exposed, but it has very high adaptive capacity. So the level of vulnerability is not going to be the same that one that is with very low exposure, but very limited capacity. So we have to look at all the components of vulnerability. I will not simplify this as the opposite there.
Okay. Yeah. So how do you place, I don't see any other questions from YouTube, just to kind of, link to some of your reflections on viability earlier. How do you link vulnerability to sustainability in your analysis? Viability is and sustainability. So is viability then a component of sustainability? Sustainability being
is
the larger.
Viability what?
Is viability then a component of sustainability? So in that case, sustainability being the larger goal and viability is just one key component of.
I guess you can make a system sustainable. So if you make it viable, but you can have something that can be, it's an example that we were saying that you can be in a community where there are all the possibilities to have an activity and can be fisheries very active and sustainable. But now fishermen don't want to be there. So it's not viable. It can be sustainable, but it's not viable because the conditions that to maintain that activity are not there. Mm-hmm. So there is more incentive to migrate or go. So that's what I said. Can be that simple, but you can have a fishery that can be in a very bad shape, and then you shift the gear to make it sustainable. That's when you lead, because this condition of vulnerability of the fishery demands a change that make it sustainable and viable. So it can be viable and sustainable.
Okay. I think we are at time. So I want to bring this to an end with a huge thank you to Dr. Sylvia Salas, for really, a wonderful and enriching presentation, right, addressing the core issues in V2V, vulnerability to viability in a global partnership, because we ask all these questions all the time. through our different activities. And thanks for enlightening us on those key questions as we explore them further. But also a huge thank yous to our audience, who most of them have joined via the YouTube live stream. So thank you very much for those meaningful questions and engaging, through the B2B Global Partnership webinar platform. We look forward to seeing you in the next month webinar. And similar, if you can bring up the poster to the screen. So next month, we have Dr. Martin Bavink from the Center for Maritime Research in University of Amsterdam, Netherlands, who is going to talk about, is legal pluralism a bane or a boon for small-scale fishing communities, with all his experiences, working in both in the developed and the developing world on small-scale fisheries and communities. I'm really looking forward to this talk next month to be another wonderful piece in addition to our B2B Global Partnership thematic webinar series. We look forward to seeing you there. And thank you, Sylvia, once again. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.